On the day of the war, the US is going to renew the supply of Ukraine. This was reported not only by Trump, who changes his mind 5 times a day, but also by the Pentagon. Moreover, the US president said that the US would send more weapons to Ukraine. Does this mean that the matter will not be limited by the renewal of Biden's assistance? The question is open. But so far, everything looks like Ukrainian diplomacy has been successful again. It is even more important that this will be a signal for Putin, who is very pleased with the stop of Kyiv's assistance. I hope that the US is on the way to stop the support of Ukraine. If Washington's support will increase and the pressure on Russia will begin to exert, then his confidence in his forces can shake strongly, which will lead, in turn, to a fair world. Russia, the Minister of Transport, Roman Stervod, for 200 years did everything himself. While the picture is not entirely known, it is written that he did it on Saturday. That is, the Russian Federation of Transport was in charge of the body for more than a day. But in any case, this did not happen since 1991. But the epidemic of the lovers of windows among Russian top managers has already become a parable. Since the old man is still an official, he overcame with a reward gun. What is remarkable, he came to the place of his future death on the enemy Tesla. Ukrainian defense forces fought off the village of Pokrovsk and also counterattacks under Lyman. This is what the Russian Z channel writes, complaining about the success of the Soviet Union. At the same time, Russia continues to move forward in the South Donetsk direction, which remains the most difficult for Ukrainian fighters. It would seem that the Russian army for the 4th year of the war will not surprise even the most close observers. But no, from time to time there are a lot of things that come out which later become commonplace. A video appeared showing how Russian military men move in chains. The army of slaves is no different, but these people are given weapons at zero, but they will not direct it against those who literally forged them. Amazingly, Putin's favorite body, General Gudkov, was not quite as good as official propaganda describes him. Zetniks write about this, saying that in fact he was an ordinary butcher who did not spare his soldiers and did not count on losses. Well, those who survived the war and were able to demobilize after being wounded or something else continue to complain that people do not consider them and do not respect them. Classic. About this and much more in today's fresh news, which you can support with your like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. All these actions help promote the video, especially your subscriptions. They are important for YouTube algorithms, especially when you subscribe in time or immediately after the video, so click on the subscribe button. But you can support the channel financially on Patreon, the link to which is in the description, and buy NVPN. This is a means of bypassing blockages that allows you to bypass blockages, watch YouTube at normal speed, Twitter, use Instagram, Discord, Steam servers, and go to sites of independent media. In general, VPN is a necessary thing now. If you want a VPN, the creator of which you know, and this is me in this case, and support important projects for you, then NVPN is your choice, the link to buy in the description. While this is legal in Russia, it is allowed to buy VPNs and use them. Well, we move on to what happened in the past day. The United States will send Ukraine more weapons for defense, Trump promised. We are going to send more weapons. They must be able to protect themselves. They are hit very hard. We will have to send more weapons, first of all defensive. So many people die in this disorder, he noted before dinner with Prime Minister of Israel Benjamin Netanyahu. This could be described in the following words of Trump, if it were not for these reassuring sounds from the Pentagon. According to President Trump, the Ministry of Defense is sending additional defensive weapons to Ukraine, so that Ukrainians could defend themselves while we will work to ensure a long-term peace and ceasefire, as stated in the statement of the Pentagon representative Sean Parnell about military aid to Ukraine. He also added, our system of assessment by the U.S. President of military supplies around the world remains valid and is an important component of our defense priorities, as part of the policy of America first of all. Let me remind you that the last stop for sending military aid was under the sauce of overestimation of American military supplies around the world, taking into account its own reserves of the U.S. Now, apparently in the Pentagon, they decided to make up a story with unilateral actions of anti-Ukrainian-minded officials of the Defense Department up to Hexit, and pretend that everything went according to the procedure. They stopped the deliveries, counted the ammunition in the disarmament for the DSM, realized that everything was fine, and then the deliveries were resumed. The only question is whether we are talking about growth, the resumption of deliveries agreed with Biden, or the delivery of additional weapons. In any case, we will prepare the mouth-to-mouth machines, but it should be remembered that Trump has funds for this. Investigator Colby Bradward wrote that the administration has $5 billion unspent funds for the PDA program, that is, for the transfer of direct American reserves, and $10 billion uncontracted funds for USI program for ordering weapons from the US defense. Does Trump do this to his friend Ukraine? There's no need to lie here. I will remind you that even these statements, in the event of their realization, will simply bring us back to the state of continued assistance issued by Biden. However, in any case, it can be noted that the diplomatic efforts of Kyiv and Zelensky personally bear fruit and demonstrate another miracle. But also the diplomatic efforts of Putin, of course, who completely refuses to recognize the objective reality. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, in a telephone conversation with the President of the United States Donald Trump on July 4, discussed the replacement of the ambassador of Ukraine in the United States. The link to the source is written by the Bloomberg agency. Among potential candidates, according to the source of the agency, is the current Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, his deputy Olga Stefanishina, Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, and Energy Minister German Galushenko. The same composition of candidates was confirmed by the source of RBC Ukraine. Zelensky suggested replacing the ambassador with a person who would be understandable in America, explained the logic of the replacement and the source of the Ukrainian edition. The president chose these candidates because these are people who have already been in contact with the Americans and other partners and have given results. This level corresponds to the level of relations with America. Now Ukraine and the United States are represented by Ambassador Oksana Makarova. The change of ambassador is considered a difficult moment for the relations of the two countries, when Washington, let me remind you, stopped the supply of weapons to Kyiv during the assessment of its own reserves of the Pentagon. This is noted by Bloomberg. As you can see, Ukraine does not hope for the mercy of Trump, but does everything possible to preserve relations with the United States. Of course, I would have sent the Americans a long time ago in their place, and publicly, but I do not have the responsibility for the lives of tens of millions of people. It remains to wish success to new servants, whoever it may be, and rejoice that I am not in their place. In the morning of July 7, Russian troops 2 times plundered Kharkov. 71 people were injured, among them 7 children. The city, the dormitory, multi-story building, supermarket, cafe, and the territory of the kindergarten were damaged, as reported by the mayor of the city, Igor Terekhov. Within 10 minutes, 6 sheiks hit the city. As a result of a drone strike in Zaporozhye, at least 20 people were injured, reported the head of the local OVA, Ivan Fedorov. The building of the university was damaged, the dormitory of the educational institution was damaged, the multi-apartment buildings, private houses, and non-living buildings were also damaged. According to the land forces in the OSU, the targets of the attack in Kharkov and Zaporozhye were the building of the TCK. The hits were recorded on the Kharkov Regional Territorial Center of the equipment and the adjacent territory. 3 soldiers were injured, as well as near the Zaporozhye Regional TCK, 1 military was wounded. In fact, the targets of the strikes are not hidden in the Russian Ministry of Defense, which were considered strikes on the territorial centers of equipment in the OSU. The Ministry of Defense did not talk about dozens of injured civilians. It is clear that the victims among civilians make these attacks, of course, criminal. Why, of course? Because even in an attack on military or near-military objects, a relationship is taken into account with the damage inflicted on the civilian population. Of course, if you killed some high-ranking general or even 2, then even 10-20 civilian casualties nearby are considered minor losses. Well, it is separately considered in each case. I will just give you an example. Well, if you have wounded 1 CCC member and killed 10 civilians, this is a minor blow and, accordingly, is a military crime. Well, again, the whole conversation about military crimes in 2025 seems to me to be superfluous. Russia, everything that Russia has been doing for 3.5 years is one major military crime. The intensity of the attack on the CCC and the waste on these strikes and resources shows. Russia believes that these are important objects, and it will be harder for Ukrainian armed forces without them, and this is certainly true. It is important to understand that any Russian efforts are destroyed by Ukrainian unity, and now is the right time for the antagonism between the TCC and a part of society in Ukraine to end. To do this, both the authorities and the society must make an effort. I hope that it will be possible, as it has been possible all the past years, to counteract the attempts of Russia to disband the Ukrainian society. Both the TCC and the citizens of Ukraine and the authorities are working together to stop Russian aggression. Without a doubt, nobody wants to die in a war. Without a doubt, a defensive war with a superior enemy is impossible without mobilization, and mobilization is rarely voluntary. Without a doubt, there is an excess of allowances from the side, including the TCC. We have seen such videos, and the authorities should do everything to eliminate these serious deaths. There are not so many of them. Russia makes a wide case out of each of them, and Russia does it on purpose. There are a lot of resources at stake. Basically, if you look at it, there are 1 or 2 episodes a month. If you don't think that forced mobilization is a violation, it is not a violation. But in any case, the replenishment of the front is what the Ukrainian army will fall without. And Russia will capture cities, capture people, build new Bucks, new Irpin, new Mariupol. And we can only fight it together, not by talking, but on the contrary, joining forces in front of the enemy. And Ukraine has already received this many times over these 3.5 years. Let's hope that Ukraine will not be a friend even now. Russian troops continue to use the tactic of double strike, which is a war crime without suspicion of conscience. In Kherson and Kharkov, rescuers attacked those who had eliminated the consequences of the shelling, said the GSC. In the morning of July in Kherson, as a result of the shelling, a gas station caught fire. There were fire and rescue units. During the evacuation and the fire, they were hit again. The car cistern was damaged. There are no victims among the staff and civilians. In Kharkov on the same night, a similar situation was recorded. After the attack, a fire broke out and the rescuers who arrived were hit again. Fire equipment was damaged. Fortunately, there are no victims either. At the end of the shelling, the Russian tankers do not hide the facts of the GSC strikes. On the contrary, the Russian units of the 18th General Army in the group of the Dnieper troops openly boasted about the strikes in Kherson, publishing a video from the drone. The State Service of Emergency Situations becomes the target in the case of creating an obstacle to the excitement of combat tasks, the Russian pilots wrote on the channel. Transport is out of order, the live force has not been injured, the goal has been achieved, they wrote. Russian military criminals in Kherson are trying to justify at the level of the federal media. For example, this message was published by the state agency TASS. Kherson has become a prefrontal city where militants are located everywhere in the Soviet Union. The administration of the city exists only before the law. TASS was told by the security forces about this. Do you understand their idiotic logic, which they try to sell? If there are only Soviet Unionists in Kherson, then you can kill them anywhere, including directly in civilian. But this is certainly not the case. Kherson tries to live even under Russian blows, although real ghosts appear in the city. Editor of the Kherson website Most told the Ukrainian 24th channel that the Kherson people are trying to improve their lives, despite constant shelling. At the same time, the military, which is located in the Kherson direction, insists on evacuation because every day staying in Kherson or the region is a threat to life. On the one hand, there are cafes, markets, and shops working in Kherson you can even call a taxi. There are signs of peaceful life almost everywhere, despite the problem. On the other hand, thousands of people who create this illusion of peaceful life risk their own lives every day, he emphasized. The areas on which most of all suffer from constant Russian attacks are partially wiped out. Shops and establishments are closed there, but people who walk 5 km to the city center to work continue to live there. Public transport in these areas is no longer running, only the police and ambulance. Russians often attack minibuses. There is not a single one in Kherson that would not be damaged. Closed plywood windows are the usual history of public transport in the city. Everything looks very surreal, Nacke added. Kherson is the city that Russia is constantly shelling, where it arranges safaris for people. It just teaches its drone operators to drop drones on peaceful people so that they train on them. There are already a lot of such murders, and there are a lot of records of such murders. This is all military crimes, and Russian soldiers will answer for this. With their life or their freedom, it will work out. But in order for Ukraine to have the opportunity to continue defending itself, to have the opportunity to stop Russian aggression, to defend our relatives, our homes, our homeland, we continue to help the Ukrainian troops as much as we can. And here is another collection of cars for the Novo unit. Here is their address to you. We wish you good health. We are the battalion of the Novo unmanned systems. We refer to Mike Nacke and his community for help in closing the collection of transport for our unit. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. Here is a QR code in the description of the Monobank, PayPal, USDT, Bitcoin. All this is available so that you can support Ukrainian military so that they can buy transport and accordingly perform combat missions. Thanks to everyone who participates in the collections. I, of course, as always, will also participate in the collection. Well, we move on. New collapse of the century. Hundreds of flights were delayed in Pulkovo. Passengers were not officially informed that the reason for the threat of BPA. Last weekend, I remind you, in cities throughout Russia, almost 2,000 flights were delayed, almost 500 were cancelled. Passengers who were supposed to fly through the St. Petersburg airport of Pulkovo were also affected. Insider talked to one of the eyewitnesses who waited for her flight for 12 hours and could not leave St. Petersburg for Samara. There were huge queues at the airport, there were no connections, Wi-Fi, flights were postponed, and it was only possible to find out that the reason for the delay was actually a threat to the pilots. I approached the guy who checked me in and he didn't know anything, sent me to a certain representative of the violin. I went to him and asked, "Dmitry, tell me please what's wrong with my flight?" And he looks at me with surprised eyes and says, "Actually, we have a plumber for half an hour already." But of course the main victim was perhaps the Minister of Transport Roman Starovoyt, fired by Vladimir Putin from this post on Monday. However, it turned out that he was not the 500th. This is the first official of such a high level, Spuch 91, who made a life count during the execution of the duty or immediately after the resignation. According to the initial data, the official was shot in his house in Podmoskovnoye-Odintsovo. Going forward, I will say that later Podmentovny channel changed the testimony. For suicide, he used a reward weapon received from the MIA leadership in 1923, writes the VCHK at the GPU. According to preliminary data, suicide may be connected with a probable criminal case, writes the VCHK. According to this channel, the testimony against the ex-minister was given by his agent at the post of head of the Kursk region, Alexei Smirnov. Also, according to this mesh, the testimony against him was given by the former general director of the Corporation Development of the Kursk region, Vladimir Lukin, and the Kursk deity Maxim Vasiliev. Starovitsev himself, as the channel writes, was suspected of fraud in a particularly large scale. At the same time, the VCHK of the GPU reports that a criminal case was initiated against the ex-minister under the article Fraud and Debt. In the last case, the suicide of a federal minister-level official became the suicide of the ex-head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the USSR and a participant of the August Putsch of 1991, Boris Puga. He shot himself from his apartment in Moscow on August 22, 1991. Vladimir Putin fired the Starovoidov on Monday. His place was taken by the ex-governor of the Novgorod region, Andrew Nikitin. The media reported that these frame changes had been prepared for several months. Kremlin did not name the reason for the resignation, but several pro-government political scientists reported that the most likely version of the resignation was the case of corruption in the construction of protective structures in the Kursk region. This allegedly influenced the speed of progress in the CIS during the invasion in the region in August last year. The way this is not true. Well, that is, it seems to me that this whole story with the criminal case for strengthening in the Kursk region is an attempt by the military to cover their ass at the expense of the civil authorities. This, of course, does not mean that they did not steal on the construction of fortifications. In Russia, they steal on everything and everything. But the main narrative sounds like the officials stole everything and the defense line was not built. However, everything was at least the opposite. In fact, we all saw the Ukrainian video of the first hours of the operation, how the Russian defense line had to break through with the help of engineering equipment, including the installation of demining and mine trucks. Moreover, the Ukrainian military later showed in the video the fortifications that were built in the Kursk region, which they took and noted that very high-quality fortifications and how great it will be now for the Ukrainian military. Here's what CNN said when it spoke with one of the participants of the Kursk operation. One soldier with the call Finn said that the Russian fortifications were built very skillfully, combining different types of defensive measures. For example, the mines were placed under the anti-tank dams known as the Dragon's Tooth. According to him, his entire crew, 4 people with long-term experience, was completely exhausted. They were among the first units to cross the border with Russia and were sent for demining and disassembly of defensive structures before the arrival of the Ukrainian infantry and artillery. They spent 2 weeks inside the Kursk region, working non-stop, spending a couple of hours of sleep here and there, always on a check. The Ukrainian success of the Kursk region was due, in particular, to the fact that any fortification costs no more than those who occupy it. And it turned out to be the Esrochniki and Kadyrovtsi, who at the first shots either ran away or went to surrender in packs. But let's get back to our days. In the Telegram channels, after the report on the suicide of former Minister of Transport Roman Starovoidsev, a video appeared with a car of an official Tesla Model X parked at a park in the village of Romashko in the Odintsovsky district of Moscow. The newspaper writes that this video was shot on Monday. At the same time, the sources of the Forbes RBC said that Starovoidsev died more than a day before that. This can be confirmed by the statement of the head of the State Duma Committee on Defense, Andrei Kartopolova, video and photo from the place where Starovoidsev was found. Telegram channels 112, Baza, shot. Met published. Baza and Shot reported that Starovoidsev shot himself not in the car cabin, but a few meters away from it. The body, according to the database, was found yesterday in the bushes near Tesla with a bullet wound to the head. Mesh reported that their minister walked away into the bushes from the fence to hide from the eyes of possible passersby, and there, the body was found by the police. According to the Shot, the body was found by the personal security of the Starovoid who arrived at the parking lot at the service area of Yoris. The ex-minister, and he himself, by the way, was moving on Tesla. For some reason, the deceased did not like the Russian representative class cars. This, by the way, is at least dangerous. Well, that is, the car of the American company stuffed with electronics and cameras is such a large potential espionage equipment cooler than the iPhone. I am sincerely surprised that the Russian top officials were not forbidden such jokes. The body of the Starovoid was identified by his assistant and reported the shot at about 17 o'clock on July 7. The sources say otherwise. Supposedly, the Starovoid died on Sunday night on Sunday. Previously, Forbes reported with a link to the sources of the investigative bodies. RBC, with a link to its sources in law enforcement bodies, wrote that the Starovoid body was identified on Saturday. The head of the State Duma Committee on Defense, Andrei Kartopolov, said before that the suicide of the Starovoid happened a long time ago. This is all a bit strange because remember I told you yesterday that he was allegedly at the meeting on the explosion of the Russian tanker in Ust-Luga. It turns out that by that moment he was already dead, and in general it's funny, about a day before the explosion, the dead man answered. By the way, there is a recording of the seaman as an assistant to the Starovoid, who has now become the minister, smiling when journalists say that the day was hard. Good afternoon, it's hard for you today, congratulations, thank you. Well, in general, apparently, Andriy Nikitin was not a big fan of his boss. In the meantime, another death occurred. According to the shot right in the workplace in the building on the old basement, the deputy head of the Land Fund Department, 42-year-old Andriy Kornishuk, died. He suddenly stood up during the meeting, fell dead. The doctors could not help him anymore. It is assumed that Kornishuk's heart could not stand when he found out about the death of the old man, or just knew too much. But it sounds like nonsense, of course. I also sometimes get up from bed and say, oh, here it is, old age. Oh, I got up too abruptly. To get up and die, it sounds pretty strange. Well, in principle, let's talk about some kind of deadly epidemic for top officials and managers of the Russian Federation in the coming videos. The drone Gura was attacked by the Ilyusha NPP in the Krasnodar territory. The blow came from one of the technological workshops, reported by the Union sources. It is reported that this enterprise takes, processes, and unloads oil, including for the needs of the Russian army, and therefore is considered to be part of the Russian military infrastructure. The blow was also confirmed by local Russian resources. We are glad that the Ukrainian authorities do not forget about the old Russian oil mine. Moreover, this is not only a dilapidated cow of the Russian budget, but also the basis of Russian logistics. According to the Ukrainian military explorer Mushevitz, during the previous wave of attacks on the NPP and oil bases, the Russian army, when attacking, is forced to rely on the civil infrastructure of oil transport and oil products. In fact, this was observed from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, when the entire Russian offensive on Kyiv was held at the Mazer NPP in Belarus. Then, due to political reasons, the NPP and other objects in Belarus decided not to hit. But for strikes in Russia, there are no such restrictions, fortunately. Just yesterday, I told you about the success of the defense force in Sumchina. I will not repeat, but I will show for the sake of the picture how the Ukrainian aviation provides these very successes. The Ukrainian channel, Sonyashnik, is associated with the air forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. I published another video of an airstrike using the cab of Western production. According to the geolocation of the project Vorokiev, the bomb flew over the bridge in the village of Zalodovka, Leshkovsky district, Kursk region. Russian logistics is in this direction, and so the strikes of Ukrainian drones are suffering, and now more impressive means of destruction are being added to them. On the eastern flank of the Pokrovsk direction, the Ukrainian forces had some successes, says the Z-vlogger Anatoly Radov. The VSU knocked down the village of Popov Yar, he writes. The fights are going south, the village is operated by Sharda and aviation. It is interesting that on the map of Deep State, Russian armed forces did not enter Popov Yar at all. Perhaps there, once again, a small Russian group ran there, because of which the Z-vloggers recorded the villages captured, and then it was possible to destroy them. Either way, both sides agree that Popov Yar is in favor of the defense forces of Ukraine, and the Russian movement is at least pre-stopped in the north, in the outskirts of Konstantinovka from the west. Z-Channel, which had already buried the third assault on Rykhodub in the Lymanian direction, now writes that it is developing with a new force. The defense forces not only control the Rykhodub itself, but also break through to the next one, to the east of Katerynovka. This is how the Z-vloggers report on the situation. According to the information, the enemy is still on the farms and partially in Rykhodub. The DRG and the VSU have entered the Katerynovka district. The situation in this area is characterized by a counterattack. The enemy and the troops of the Western troops are making an offensive in this area. Our units continue to advance here in the direction of Glushchenkovo and are fighting in the New World. Fights continue in the Green Valley and the advance of our units in the heights of Kashandrigalov. The Z-vlogger Anatoly Radov describes the situation in even darker tones. Ukrainians still continue to enter Rykhodub and have settled in the buildings of the farm, he writes. The artillery regularly works on them, so they are there for sure. The storm describes the situation even worse. Half of Rykhodub is behind the Ukrainians, while they are slowly pushing in the direction of Novgorsk. Also, apparently, the Ukrainians have penetrated into Katerynovka with small groups. Radov wrote a little later that they are working with mortars on him. Even looking at the military corps maps, you can see that the situation for the Russians in the region of Glushchenkovo and the New World, and the potential ones in the region of Karpovka and the Green Valley, looks more and more threatening. In such cases, the Russian command usually throws everything and directs all forces to restore the lost positions. Let's see how the events on this site will develop. Meanwhile, the Russians do not stop trying to dig up the Ukrainian plaza on the eastern shore of the Kizhyribets. Deep State makes a video of the Ukrainian 63rd Separate Mechanized Brigade with a reflection of the Russian motorcycle storm to the east of Tursky. Moreover, analysts note that this attack is not the only one, but so far they have been reflected. On the video, by the way, it is clearly seen how sad it is for the Russians to attack without armored vehicles. The Russian motorcyclists were restored not only with the help of the pro-grandfather's barbed wire, but also with the help of the so-called garlic, construction of metal rods that were used even before our era against the cavalry, and now successfully slow down the wheel vehicles. Of course, this would not be an obstacle for armor, but it is not given out to the Russians, so they were unwrapped on these barriers with the help of artillery, mortars, and FPV drones. In my opinion, the volunteer of the Russian Project Oryx Yakub Yanovsky writes, who calculates the loss of Russian equipment. If the Ukrainians manage to scale the anti-missile and anti-cavalry defense, they will have a good chance to stabilize the front line, because Russia can no longer afford to lose thousands of armored vehicles for the sake of insignificant promotion here or there. the south of the Donetsk region, a difficult situation for the Ukrainian defense forces is preserved. The State Department is fixing the occupation of Podobny, as well as the promotion of Russian armed forces in the Ravapol region. At the same time, the Russian forces still fail to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region and will completely strengthen themselves there and in this direction. Situation in the Zaporozhye region is getting worse. Here, Deep State reports about the occupation of Lobkov, the liberated one entering the counteroffensive of 1923, as well as the advance of the Russians in the Sevoy district. The offensive in Russian armed forces is expanding, but apparently it still has a tactical nature. So far, we do not have to talk about a breakthrough not only in Zaporozhye, but also on the front of Orkhov and Kamyshev, although the situation here can change. The Russian army captured 203 square kilometers in Ukraine in less than a week. This is evidenced by the analysis by the Agency for the Closed Defense of Ukraine and the Deep State Project. This is the fastest weekly theme of the promotion of the Russian military in Ukraine since mid-November last year. The figure can also testify to the fact that Russia continues to increase the pace of the offensive. 1 week in July, the Russian army occupied almost 40% of the occupied territory for the whole of June. I will not give you the whole post of the agency, especially since there are approximately the same reports about the situation in certain areas, which I have already told you about with the words of the same Konstantin Mashchev. Instead, let's talk once again about what is wrong with this post and this methodology. Let's recall the situation that arose at the end of June. Roughly speaking, in Deep State it was estimated that in May Russian armed forces captured 400 square kilometers of territory, and in June 500. In the ASIN community of Blackbird, the group, on the contrary, counted 500 square kilometers in May and June 400. Moreover, they read about capturing about the same territory. Well, from these calculations, you can make literally opposite conclusions. As we can see, the look at only two sources shows that everything is at least not so unambiguous. The agency has its own conclusions based on the data of only one Deep State, which may have their own reasons to mark or not to mark changes at the front. Of course, this practically never happens every day, and sometimes with a significant delay, until analysts get confirmation of certain changes from their sources in the defense forces of Ukraine. For example, there are no Ukrainian counterattacks on the Deep State map now. Neither in Sumshina nor in the Levant direction. They, of course, will appear there if the Ukrainians manage to secure themselves on the reached borders, but this will not happen immediately. If, depending on the situation, you can still make some far-reaching conclusions, then the changes on the map in a week do not reflect the real events on the front line in this very week. Of course, if the Russians continue to capture 200 square kilometers in the next week, then you can already strike an alarm, but at the same time, it is not worth deeply analyzing every change on the map, otherwise we will all turn into a collective Julian Ryabka. This is the type of journalist built who has been pumping his audience since 1922 is rocking himself on emotional swings, where each flag of the KVSRF is a disaster, and each Ukrainian counterattack is a core breakthrough in the course of the war. Let's still look at sober things and use different sources with all due respect for the state, which really are the best analysts of this war in terms of the promotion of both armies. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine launched the .Chain Defense, a digital marketplace platform which will soon simplify the supply of weapons to the defense forces, and this was announced by the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov. .Chain Defense is a digital platform that will allow the military to choose the weapons purchased by the Defense Purchases Agency. It works like a modern marketplace that allows you to quickly order and make weapons without unnecessary bureaucracy and in as short a time as possible. And brigades will take part in the pilot launch, which the Ministry of Defense allocated to the Defense Purchases Agency $1 billion hryvnia. These brigades, through these systems of the state operator of the rear, will be able to order both PV drones and soon other types of weapons. As explained by the heads of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, each military unit will have the opportunity to choose exactly what it needs to fulfill the task. The Defense Purchasing Agency will provide financing and delivery without unnecessary bureaucracy. It is expected that .Chain Defense will allow to reduce the delivery cycle from months to a few weeks. How does the system work? The military independently choose, order, and reserve the necessary funds, see the delivery dates, leave reviews, and receive quick answers. Manufacturers receive a clear mechanism of cooperation with the state and the army, as well as direct feedback from the military. The state sees the real needs of the front, makes a decision based on the data, supports the development of the OPC and the implementation of innovations. Each military unit will have a personal cabinet and a certain amount of virtual funds. A list of all drones located in the system with a list of characteristics, price of technical parameters, ratings, and reviews will be available in the vitrine section. When ordering, the representative of the military unit will be able to specify the required number of equipment. If the request exceeds the available stock of the manufacturer, the system will allow you to make a preliminary order. There is also a forecast of the terms of delivery, both available and pre-ordered drones. The entire bureaucratic part of the process, from signing contracts with the manufacturer to controlling the delivery, will be carried out by the AOC. While developing the platform, we were primarily focused on the needs of the military. In principle, it was important to provide them with the freedom of choice because it is they who know better than anyone what BPAs with what characteristics are needed for a specific task. .Chain Defense gives such an opportunity. In addition, we significantly reduce logistics thanks to the direct interaction of the military part of the supplier. This will allow you to reduce the time from ordering to delivering the drone to the opposition first for a few weeks, and then for days, said Arsen Zhumadilov, director of the Defense Purchase Agency. In the future plans, the gradual expansion of the nomenclature of UAVs, ammunition and RRTRs and ground robot complexes. The introduction of the dot-chain defense is part of the new model of UAV purchases from the AOC. Such innovations should not be overlooked because this is an important part of the process of leaving the small Soviet army. The Soviet supply system has always been built according to the underlying principle. At the top, they decide what is needed or who needs something specific. Reverse connection, that is, the ability to indicate that we do not need this, but that and more, usually works badly. The new system not only simplifies and decentralizes the process, but also allows to form a state order and a strategy for the development of defense based on the real needs of the front, and not on the ideas of high offices. Let's hope that the system will work as intended. Why am I spending so much time? You can say that I was paid for the promotion of the system, but it does not need to be promoted. It does not sell to anyone, it goes among the units. No, the fact is that in this war, for 3.5 years looking at both armies, I see the same problems in a number of areas. For example, what they supply is useless. Well, that is, just imagine you are an official who determines you are like this, well, here. To receive feedback, to transmit it to the manufacturer, to turn on contracts, this is a complete, so to speak, bureaucratization of the process that prevents the military from fighting. In Russia, it is invariably, well, that is, it will not change, I do not know, in 10 years maximum, if Russia survives and then will turn into a composition of good countries. Well, we will not even guess how it can be, too fanatic, but if Ukraine learns to do it, then it will be awesome. It will be very good, especially together with EBA, where you can also order your own samples, because the unit that can long-term plan its own action, that is, have access to direct orders. In the weapons and instructions that they need and in what amount of understanding when it comes, this is what can lead to a completely different level, especially in the context of the line of drones that Ukraine is worth. So I am very careful about this. We will hope that it will work. We will hope that it will not be screwed up. We will hope that it is not profanation. Very big prospects that can seriously directly affect the war. I have already told you about the strange love of Putin for the deceased commander of the General Gudkov and twice a hero for the first time in the history of Russia. He gave him and promised to name the street and the very 155th Brigade of war criminals named after Gudkov. It is interesting that this was accompanied by the same praises of the Z Channel, where Gudkov was called almost the best officer of modernity. Moreover, this is not at all in line with the opinion of the Ukrainian side. There, I will remind you, the air reconnaissance officer Craig Forsher, who worked at Kirchner, said that with each message about the strikes on the Russian staff, they pray that the 155th commandment will not be affected, because it is difficult to find a shameless one. And finally, an alternative opinion about Gudkov appeared in the Z Center, which was found by the collector of Z folklores, Ivan Filipov. He just published the Rosguardate's channel, and it says the following. I will not write introductory words about this person, I will say so. He was a good commander, but not outstanding. He saw the storm of Novomikhailivka with his own eyes and took part in it. He saw all the shortcomings that were great with excessive loss. About the fact that he was going into battle with his brigade can be interpreted differently, but he was quite close to the front line. Under Novomikhailivka, a blow had already been made to his front line. Then the cook was still alive but was wounded. In principle, it can be said that he was with his brigade. Also, now I can say with full responsibility that despite everything, he really was a good commander, the brigade was secured, and there is always an understanding of the system and combat work at different levels in infantry units. With this, there are very big problems. Now I think the brigades will have problems. Ukrainians tore off their ears and beheaded the brigade. What will happen next and who will be in charge is not yet clear. They write that it seems that Akhmedov was sent somewhere in the direction, and many people remember the story with him under Gledar. More precisely, they remember who is still alive. Well, let's hold our fists and pray for the guys, as Podolyak says, so that the commanders put Akhmedov instead of Gudkov. And I think Craig for sure will be pleased, because if someone can compete, then it is Akhmedov and Lyman. In general, I did not want to blacken the person somehow, says Zetnik, but singing beautiful odes, knowing some nuances, conscience does not allow. I repeat once again, unfortunately we lost a good, even rather good commander who had an understanding of the system of combat work, which, by the way, is not enough for many. If he had taken people, he would not have had the price, writes Zetnik. Apparently, in the Russian army, even supposedly good commanders are the meaties who achieve their tasks, strengthening their path to fame by the corpses of subordinates. Well, what can I say, Zhukov school, although in the 155th achieved some tasks, a riddle for me. Well, that is, the brigade was washed and rinsed 4 times and never demonstrated anything successful, only beep and military crimes. Examiner of the head of the Rosgvardia, Viktor Streganov, arrested, reported in the SKR. He's accused of abuse of duties and powers and of receiving bribe in a particularly large extent. Streganov was sent to prison. When he was detained, he is not reported. This is due, as stated, to bribes at the construction of a training center in the Kyiv region. The contract for its construction was signed back in 2014, but the training center was not built. The damage to the state was about 2 billion rubles. Streganov is also accused of receiving bribes from representatives of commercial organizations in 2012 and 2014 for a sum of more than 66 million rubles. In addition, the former head of staff Halil Arslanov received 17 years of strict regime, fraud and bribe in a particularly large extent when delivering equipment to the army. Arslanov is also charged with a double fine from a bribe of more than 24 million rubles. In addition to Arslanov, the case involves the former head of orders for the improvement of the technical foundation of the FSRF management system, Colonel Pavel Gudkov, and military pensioner Yakovlev. The court recognized them guilty of fraud in a particularly large extent and sentenced them to 7 and 6 years of imprisonment. What can I say? I'm 11 years old, for example. Personally, I don't think that the Kremlin was seriously concerned with the fight against corruption. Moreover, you can see the deadlines when, for example, crimes were committed. Moreover, for now there are demonstrative arrests, important shishas are commanded in places, money is helped by subordinates, and as they can, pay off their debts. Rather, military and other security agencies have lowered their power chains to a lower level after the 22nd fiasco, and the so-called law enforcement officers have been allowed to understand that the hunting season is open. I haven't shown you the wonderful samples of Russian frontline technology for a long time. Yesterday, Putin was demonstrated modern solutions for the evacuation of wounded from the battlefield on one of the most popular shows. He writes to the Russian New Context channel. As always, everything was pompous, but no one heard about these ultra-modern technologies on the most advanced Russian frontline. The wounded are evacuated on mopeds strapped to tape. Many Russian soldiers on the front do not even have mopeds. You have to be pleased with such miracles of technology as a logistic tricycle made on the basis of a self-propelled electric cart TT. In general, this is not the worst option, given that from the Ministry of Defense you can wait in the best case of Oslakov. Well, for the balance, I present to you the amazing products of Ukrainian front craftsmen, uncontrolled by a ground drum kamikaze in the form of a motor block loaded with T-62 anti-tank mines. If you get to the enemy position, the fireworks will be unforgettable. At least, unlike the Russians in the defense forces, such terror attacks are not intended to transport people. And that's good. It seems that the Russian army will not be surprised by anything for the 4th year of the war, even by the first-ever observers, especially me. But no, from time to time there are a number of things that turn out to be ordinary. The channel Don't Wait for Good News has published a new video with the frontman providing such a comment. Some of the fighters are moving forward with their future wedged in chains. This is a clear demonstration of the inappropriate attitude of commanders to subordinates in such situations, according to military experts, describing the complex relations between military personnel and the units. It is clear that there is no need to talk about the high efficiency of military personnel performing combat missions in handcuffs. Another story about how all parents' attempts to achieve justice for children serving in the Russian army fail. Alexander Ishitnik, the father of a military personnel of the 137th Guard Parachute Regiment of War CH-14-1450, called for help. Son Alexander has been serving for 3 years on contract, went through heavy injuries, and is on rehabilitation. The last injury is one of the most severe, more than 100 shards all over the body, including 60 around the heart. The chest is broken, the hands are fixed with knitting needles. Despite the heavy condition of the fighter, as the father claims, they were sent by deception to the Kursk hospital, and in fact to the combat zone. Only after a series of calls and interference, the son was able to return to the hospital. On the way, they said that he was going to the hospital in Kursk. They got into the bus and sent him to the combat zone. The father clarified that the soldier was not given any medical help in the hospital. The military officer filed a complaint in the registry office as he was going to get married. However, the commandment did not give him a vacation, even for the wedding. In the hospital, according to Alexander, they also refused in the temporary transfer or direction of the injury. They told me, we cannot let go because we do not have enough people and our hospital should have been filled. Let it lie. It's stupid to lie in the hospital to disrupt the event. In addition, the man reported that when trying to communicate directly with the commander of the 137th Regiment, he replied rudely in his words and refused to talk. On my question to the commander of the unit, I was stupidly sent. Personally, the commander of the unit, when I came to him, told me, "Go to hell." That was the conversation. Comrade commander of the 137th Regiment, I've given you a healthy son, healthy. You've almost returned him to me in pieces. The man asks to transfer the soldier to a hospital where he lives and allow him a short-term leave for the registration of marriage. He criticized the command of the 137th Regiment for their indifferent attitude to the personal composition. Do you go there yourself, colonels? I know, yes, you go there, but you go there I don't know how many kilometers. You sit in the headquarters and you sit with these kids in the trenches. Be present when the drone arrives. I will see how you will lead your children if you don't send them there. You arrange them in the headquarters so that they get a salary and a rank. In the sales of commanders and their sons, it can only be said that the Russian headquarters have not been the safest place lately. And again about the attitude towards the so-called heroes of their own rear, where they try to pretend that they do not exist. The veteran of combat actions and head of the fight club Vidiz, Igor Semyonkin, expressed indignation by humiliating Russian military personnel at public events. We are told that we have no right to go out in uniform, congratulate our guys at the festive event. According to Semyonkin, at the Russian MMA Championship in Lermontov, which took place on June 7-11, wounded members of the Soviet Union were invited. They went out in uniform and took part in the Sportsmen's Ceremony Awards. However, this did not please the Presidium and the head of the Federation, Uchker Rashid Sayapov. Replications were heard from the hall of the meeting of the Presidium in the address of the military personnel. What are they doing here? In addition, all the photos with the part of the military personnel were deleted from social networks. By the way, Semyonkin found out that the military personnel were forbidden to appear at the official part of the military fork tournaments. The guys had to leave this event. How can we relate to this? Semyonkin emphasized that such actions are humiliating and a manifestation of disrespect for the fighters who are forced to hide their participation in the CPSU and who are forbidden to appear in the form at public events. I believe that this is humiliating, and our power and my cry of the soul, this is my calling. We must come to the detainees, we must all take measures. Well, and finally, about why everyone is afraid of the CPSU, hide from them and do not want to interact with them. In Vladikavkaz, a war participant in Ukraine stabbed his wife and daughter. As it became known from Astra, on the morning of July 7, a 58-year-old man took a kitchen knife and attacked a member of his family. 44-year-old wife of a suspected 23-year-old daughter and her second daughter, a 15-year-old, was killed in a critical condition. There was also a 9-year-old son in the apartment who attacked him with a child's cerebral paralysis. He was not injured. After the attack, the man tried to commit suicide but remained alive and was taken to the hospital where he is operated. According to the master, the man previously participated in military actions in Ukraine. Subsequently, the investigator declared the criminal case against the man and specified his age. According to the department, he is 39 years old. My name is Michael Nagy. See you soon. All the best. Bye.